It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, former First Secretary of State Damien Green, Labour MP Nadia Whittome, former Downing Street advisor and diarist Alistair Campbell, former Special Advisor and Conservative councillor Anita Boateng. Today,
vaccine nationalism or protectionism doesn't do anybody any good.
In fact, we could be accused of vaccine internationalism.
will the EU block vaccine exports to the UK? Violent clashes during a protest against the police bill are condemned.
We're just outraged as a city. It's not where we are, it's not who we are. And we'll stand together and make that statement.
And later today, we'll find out if this still stands.
As I made clear repeatedly, we will not be cutting our armed services in any form.
Let's start today's programme with one of the stories you heard there in the headlines and show everybody this headline in the Times newspaper today. Don't start vaccine war, Britain tells EU leaders. This is ahead of a virtual EU summit on Thursday, talking about an export mechanism for individual countries in the EU. Now, according to Briefing Overnight, a senior EU official said they could prevent exports of the AstraZeneca vaccine being produced at a plant in the Netherlands going to the UK, even though the UK hasn't as yet requested any doses from there. So my question to start off, Damien, with you, is are we in a vaccine war with the European Union?
No, I hope not. And it would be very irresponsible for the European Union to start a vaccine trade war. And I don't think the leaders of the EU are irresponsible. So I assume that at their meeting on Thursday, they'll come to a sensible conclusion, not least because the clue is in the title. It's a pandemic. It's all over the world. We are genuinely all in this together. And we know what happens with trade wars, which is that everyone suffers. So, as I say, it would be monumentally irresponsible for the EU to set off a trade war, and I don't think they will.
Nadia, do you think we're in a vaccine war with the EU?
What we've learned from the pandemic is that this pandemic isn't over for any of us in any part of the world until it's over for everyone in every part of the world. So we need more international cooperation, not less. And I'm disappointed by the action that is being proposed by the EU, but we need to put pressure on the government not to retaliate that and to increase international cooperation, get around the table, and to keep reiterating that this vaccine is safe too.
Right. Well, in terms of safety, one of the problems, Anita, is some of the scepticism in EU countries around the AstraZeneca vaccine itself. I think we can show our viewers the polling done by YouGov. Admittedly, it was done just before the European Medicines Agency had said that it was safe, AstraZeneca. But the figures are from yesterday. European confidence in AstraZeneca vaccine safety sinks after blood clot scare. And you can see they're pretty stark. Unsafe, 61% of people in France, 43% in Italy, and so it goes down. And that makes it very difficult in terms of encouraging people, Anita, to take the vaccine.
Absolutely. And I really feel for the people of France. We've got 16 areas now gone back into lockdown. We've got the vaccine rollout itself suffering huge delays, the greater vaccine hesitancy anyway, and the huge mixed messages from Macron have really served to undermine the health efforts in France. And I think that that is part of why this entire discussion has become so incredibly knotty. And look, I have to agree with the other panelists that the EU is really at its lowest ebb when it comes to the vaccine rollout. The EU prides itself in being a rules-based free market organisation, and I don't see how it can square that ethos with the kind of rhetoric that we are seeing right now. And I do sincerely hope that they row back from this on Thursday.
Alistair, do you agree with that?
I don't think there will be a vaccine war. I think parts of our media love the idea of continuing the sort of Brexit debate through the idea of us against Europe the whole time. And just, remember We the UK have exported no vaccines. The European Union has exported 40 million doses, 10 million of them to the UK. So I think we've just got to calm down a bit. It's an incredible success story, both the discovery and the development of the vaccines, the fact that so many millions of people have already had them, and it's going to be absolutely crucial to sorting out COVID. Along the way, there are going to be all sorts of difficulties. It's an incredibly complicated supply chains we're talking about. That's why actually I don't think there will be a kind of trade war, because it will provide a sort of nationalist vaccine war, because it will absolutely, it will tear apart these incredibly complicated supply lines. And of course, there's politics involved in this at times, but I really don't believe that this is going down the road that that's been ramped up across the media today.
Right. I mean, Damien, you were looking slightly sceptical there at the figures, perhaps, that Alistair said, but it is true, I think, over 40 million doses exported from the EU.
I was slightly raising my eyebrows at Alistair's statement that the EU had exported. Actually, these are all vaccines developed by private companies, and I think that private companies should fulfil the contracts they've signed, which they're doing their best to do. And I think that the rule of law and actually fulfilling the contracts is a really important underpinning, not just of trade in vaccines, if you like, but trade in everything. And I echo Anita's point. The EU is a rules-based organisation. The rules are that AstraZeneca has signed contracts with Britain and with other countries, and they should be allowed to fulfil those contracts to the best of their ability. That way, we will get the maximum speed vaccine rollout all over the place. And the problems that there have been in some other European countries with vaccine rollout are absolutely nothing to do with Britain.
I mean, just finally, Alistair, the trial results, as you will know, from the US have come out today. Good news for AstraZeneca, extremely effective and safe, says the regulator there. How do you think that makes the EU look on the international stage?
I honestly think, Jo, we're trying to politicise this too much. First of all, if you really want to pick on a country that doesn't export, then it's the United States, who sit on millions of doses. I think that the European Union, they are in the same boat as we are, and the European Union countries, in that they want to get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible. And Damien's right. I'm not talking about the EU exporting, but they're being exported from the EU. There's no ban on them being exported.
Yes.
And I believe that there will be. And also, I saw a report on French television news last night where, it was only a vox pop and it was just people standing there, but they talked to people queuing to get their vaccinations. And there was none of this kind of, anti-vaxxer scepticism that we keep being told is rampant across the rest of the European Union.
OK, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk about the protests in Bristol overnight. We're going to start showing you the pictures at the start of the protest. You can see very peaceful. The police said about 3,000 or so people marching in protest against the police and crime bill being introduced by the government. You can see them gathering there, but it turned much more sinister and violent with about 400 to 500 people involved in rioting, really. You can see them attacking or trying to attack police, setting police vehicles on fire, and a number of police have been injured. There have been 7 or so arrests. Nadia, you're a vocal critic of the bill, but there can't be any justification, can there, to those scenes that I've just shown our viewers?
I was one of the people who attended the protests in London against police violence and against the policing bill. As you say, those protests in Bristol started off pretty uneventfully and they were very relaxed. And then something changed and we need an investigation into what happened. And it's not appropriate for me to comment on that until there's been an investigation, because there has also been footage and reports of police violence, police using batons against protesters, horses and police dogs. What we've got to be asking is why this is happening in the first place. And this is happening because Priti Patel is introducing the policing bill, another step in our descent into authoritarianism. And it's a bill that would massively reduce and even criminalise the right to protest. It would criminalise Gypsy Roman traveller communities. And it could mean up to 10 years in prison for damaging a statue, while we still have as little as 4 years for rape. That's what people are angry about. And I think that these scenes are a symptom of the powerlessness that people have been feeling, particularly young people.
Well, what do you think, particularly on that last point, Damien?
I think that answer was disgraceful, I'm afraid to say. It's trying to blame the police or the government for the fact that a few hundred people, hooligans, tried quite deliberately to attack the police, to take over what had been a peaceful rally, as so often sadly happens. So a few hundred extremists came there with the intent to cause mayhem and succeeded. And they need the full power of the law against them. And I think trying to blame the police and still more the Home Secretary for that is appalling. That's just not the case. You've got to condemn that type of violence. We can have civilized democratic debate about the powers in the police bill, which incidentally are not at all, as Nadia has just described them. They are a sensible mixture of measures, some of which extend to static demonstrations, the powers the police already have over marches, and some others of which improve rehabilitation of offenders and so on. So there's a lot of very good stuff in the police bill. But whatever you think about the police bill, you have to condemn the type of violence we saw in Bristol last night.
Nadia, do you want to condemn the violence you saw in Bristol last night?
Until we know what happened, I'm not going to get in the business of condemning people, but we need to remember what this is fundamentally about. And it is about a bill that is taking away people's rights. And this is a response to that. The things that people object to most about the scenes that we saw last night, things like setting vehicles on fire, breaking windows, those things are already rightly criminal offences, and that's not what the bill aims to stop. This bill is about criminalising the right to protest, criminalising certain communities, and it represents a descent into authoritarianism. And no matter what your thoughts are on the scenes in Bristol last night, which still need to be investigated, we need to unify in condemning this bill.
Damien?
Well, I don't condemn this bill, and indeed, until 2 days before it's put before Parliament, Labour weren't going to vote against it. But as I say, my ultimate point here, I'll happily debate the merits of the police bill. But you have to start in a democratic society, in a peaceful society, from a position that people who set out to cause violence, to attack police officers, are wrong and need to be condemned.
Right, Alistair, the scenes that we have shown and that you will have seen too, do they undermine the campaign that Nadia is talking about, the campaign, legitimately in her mind, against the policing bill? The police bill, I should say.
I think they do, and I think also there's a danger that they'll be, if you like, exploited in future debate about it. I mean, I condemn the violence unreservedly, and I feel real sympathy for the police at the moment. They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't in relation to COVID protesting. They're also, I think, they've been put in a totally invidious position. The Police Federation had a survey, I think it was last week or the week before, that 1 in 10 police officers thought that the guidelines they were trying to explain to the public were clear. But I think, and all this idea that, AC, AB, all cops are bastards, all cops are not. And most cops actually are decent people doing a very, very difficult job. Now, all that being said, I think the police bill, I agree with Damien, I think there are some good parts to it. I agree with Nadia that there are some terrible parts to it. And I think the terrible parts that have provoked an awful lot of people have been put there partly to provoke people. I was speaking to one of Damien's colleagues last week. I won't say who it is, he wouldn't thank me. But he said, you've got to understand a lot of what this government is doing now is to wind people like you and me up. Now, what I would say is on this, argue the merits of the case. It is wrong in a democratic society like ours to try to curb the right to protest, which the government is trying to do. It is also wrong then to try to use that as an excuse to turn violent against the police who are there to protect us all.
All right. Before I move on, no more swear words if possible, just the time of day. On to you, Anita. The Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, says we shouldn't allow a small minority to prevent legitimate criticism of the bill. Do you agree with him on that?
I mean, this is extraordinary. I think the mayor of Bristol was really clear. He said this was selfish. He said it was self-indulgent, and he said it was self-centered. That's his words on the violence that we saw last night. But we have a sitting Labour MP that is refusing to admit that this was selfish and dangerous behaviour, and actually seems to be insinuating some kind of conspiracy that perhaps was instigated by the police. And I think this is really, really irresponsible language, and honestly quite remarkable. On the issue of substance, I mean, I really do think that we're going to have further debates about this legislation, and I absolutely take the point that, you know, there are elements of this bill that are going to be subject to further debate. But I think Alistair is also pretty ungenerous in seeing this as a game. This is a serious issue, and I don't believe that the Conservative government is throwing points into legislation in order to provoke a political reaction. I think that really it's in keeping with what the public want to see, which is a bit more robustness around what kind of society they want people to lead. They want to be tougher on sentencing. They want to be tougher on sexual assault. And I think we're seeing that coming through this legislation. And I think to sort of this, it's a 300-page bill, and it is not a series of games for the Conservative Party.
All right, before I come back to Alistair, though, Nadia, do you want to take this opportunity now, having listened to the rest of the panel? Keir Starmer, your party leader, has also condemned the violence, along with the Mayor of Bristol. Do you want to condemn the violent scenes that we have just shown all our viewers from last night?
Of course, Jo, I don't want to see violence against anybody.
So you condemn it?
And I wish everybody who's been hurt in this a speedy recovery. I'm not going to, as I've already said, I'm not going to get into the business of condemning protesters until we know exactly what's happened.
Right, but if you're condemning the violence, you do have to condemn some of those people that we can see quite clearly from the pictures were setting fire to police vans. Police officers have been injured and they were attacking the police. Responding, actually, to what Anita said as a Labour MP, do you want to just straightforwardly say that was wrong?
I don't want to see violence being perpetrated against anybody, and I wish everybody who's been harmed a speedy recovery. But as I say, I'm not going to get into condemning protesters when we don't know what's happened yet. We need a full investigation into what's happened on the side of protesters, as is happening, but also on the side of the police. That's just the function of a democratic society. All
right, well, people can obviously make their own judgments about what you've said. Alistair, do you want to respond to what Anita said in response to what you called games in terms of the Conservative government over this?
Yeah, well, I was quoting a Conservative MP who told me that is partly what they were doing. And honestly, Anita, I know this is a really serious subject, and crime and policing is and it's a big bill. I get that, and there's a lot in it I think deserves support. But please, let's not pretend that the Conservative Party and the current Conservative Prime Minister don't spend a lot of their time thinking about how they try to set traps for their political opponents, because they do. So I don't think we should be so naive as to think there isn't a fair amount of politics in this bill as well.
All right, Anita, do you want to respond?
Well, thank you, Alistair. I do understand how the government tends to work, and I also do accept that this has put Labour in a difficult political position, but that's really due to their lack of coherence about what they object to in the bill and their own vision for law and order, which we haven't seen. In the instance of this bill, we have seen Labour attack it from the left and argue that actually they are not happy with, for instance, the laws around protesting, but also attack it from the right and say sentencing on some issues is not tough enough. And the lack of coherence for Labour's position has put them in this awkward position, not the Conservative Party.
Can I just refer you to this tweet? This perhaps to you, Damien, from Peter Fahy, who's the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester. It comes back to a point made by Alistair a bit earlier. I worry that police officers in Bristol were inhibited from using necessary force to stop protesters from attacking them because of the lack of support they saw the Met receive when trying to enforce the law last weekend. That was criticism about the way they policed the vigil for Sarah Everard. Do you accept there are mixed messages coming from politicians who are asking the police to enforce the law and then don't like it when they do sometimes?
Well, there are different messages coming from different politicians, and clearly, we all saw the scenes at the vigil for Sarah Everard, and I think it's reasonable to conclude that some of the policing there wasn't at the highest standards that we want. But I mean, fundamentally, I think the vast majority of this country support the police rightly. They do a very difficult job. They put themselves in physical danger every time they go to work. As you say, I think people can form their own view about politicians who won't condemn violent demonstrators who set out clearly, given what they had with them, to cause the maximum mayhem and damage and violence to police officers, as well as to property. And if we can't all agree that that is behaviour to be condemned, then we are in a bad place. And the underlying point about the vigil was, of course, the very, very serious debate about the safety of our streets and the enforcement of the law on rape and things like that. So can I take the chance to challenge something Nadia slipped in, which was that the sentence for rape is now less than the sentence for damaging a statue. Simply factually not true. The maximum sentence for damaging a statue is 10 years under this bill. The maximum sentence for rape is life, and it should be. Rape is one of the most disgusting crimes that people commit, and it deserves the full power of the law, and it gets it.
Do you accept that, Nadia? The maximum sentence for rape is life?
What I said is that this new bill could land someone up to 10 years in prison for damaging a statue, yet as little as 4 for rape. That's the minimum penalty. What I said is factually correct.
Right. We just have to be clear about exactly what we're comparing. There are average sentences and there are maximum sentences too. We're going to move on and talk about the armed forces. This headline in The Times: Tories to cut army by 10,000 troops despite election pledge. An election pledge made by Boris Johnson in December 2019. Let's have a listen to the Prime Minister himself on this.
As I made clear repeatedly, we will not be cutting our armed services in any form. We will be maintaining the size of our armed services. And I'm delighted to see Secretary of State for Defence nodding fervently in the front row. And that's because we are increasing funding for our armed services. Right. Well, listening to that, Damien, is he about to break that manifesto pledge?
Well, no. I mean, clearly what he's saying is that what we want is to increase spending and increasing effectiveness of the armed forces. I think one of the good things about this review is that it's an integrated review. It's actually bringing our defence posture in line better with our diplomatic posture, our trade policy and so on, so that we actually do have a coherent view of the rest of the world.
Damien, most people listening to the Prime Minister will have assumed during the campaign he didn't intend then to cut the army by 10,000 troops, which is what's being reported. We will hear, obviously, for certain later on today from the Defence Secretary.
Yeah, but what I'm most concerned about, and what I think people watching, and indeed people in the armed services will be most concerned about, is to be effective, is to make sure that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that have been made by this country in history, which is that we prepare ourselves to fight the last war. It's clear that future conflicts are going to involve a lot more science, a lot more artificial intelligence, a lot more use of troops in a way that is different from previous wars and previous types of warfare. There are different types of war going on now. And actually what the integrated review seeks to do is to do that and put our defence forces in the best position to fight the future wars rather than past wars.
Well, do you agree with that, Alistair, or can it be effective with 10,000 fewer troops?
I think it's hardly doubtful that it will be. I mean, obviously, the nature of warfare changes and the nature of military planning changes, but I really think that having damaged ourselves fundamentally in terms of soft power, if you like, through Brexit. I think this is damaging us in terms of hard power. And I think that you're hearing from some of our closest allies, including the United States, that I think they're genuinely worried that the British Army, which has got one of the best reputations in the world, you're going to be able to fit the entirety of it into Old Trafford Football Stadium. And I think, yes, you're going to have all this. You can have all this, wonderful technological advance, and I see some of the videos that the MOD are putting out showing what can be done. But I think that when you now think that the United States Special Forces will be bigger than our entire army, don't think anybody, and I suspect Damien agrees with this deep down, I don't think anybody can think that that is a good step for Britain's defences.
Right. Anita, what do you think? I mean, Lord Richards has said the proposed numbers wouldn't be enough to protect or take back the Falklands in the future.
Yes, and when I saw the announcement about the increase or removal of the cap on nuclear warheads, I was like, this is a curious announcement. I can't see what the kind of concrete plans are. And now I think in the context of possible reductions to the army, it makes a lot of sense politically. Like, this is the government having to possibly smooth the path for some reductions, which will be challenging politically, perhaps on the backbenches. But really, I think so that's a political problem. But in terms of practicalities, it does seem as though funding isn't the central issue. And so there is some logic to having a more future-facing plan for defence that deals with the realities of modern warfare, which is essentially expansions of the internet, proliferation of technology, autonomous systems, all of that. And that does feel like it fits quite well with the broader strategy the government outlined from last week, which is very much looking to future threats.
Nadia, how do you see it?
I think in part the integrated review is fuelled by technological development. I think it's mostly driven by spending cuts. And what I think we need to focus on
well, when you say spending cuts, where are you talking about spending cuts? Because the government certainly claims it's spending a significant amount of money in terms of defence.
Yeah, the army is shrinking.
Right, yeah, in terms of the numbers, right.
And I think the point that we need to be making here is that this is about people. So we need to look at the reasons why the army struggles to recruit, and we need to look at the support that is available to our troops and veterans, mental health support, support with accommodation. The rates of homelessness for people when they leave the army is extremely high, and that's what I want to see more funding for. I'm really concerned about more money for nuclear weapons and expansion in Trident. I don't want to see that happen, particularly not when we're saying that we can only afford a 1% pay rise for nurses, which in real terms is a pay cut, of course. We need to be thinking of future generations, people of my generation who don't want to see a world of nuclear weapons, and this does the opposite of the direction that we should be moving.
I mean, the priorities are wrong, Damien.
Well, I don't think they are. We have defence forces to keep us safe, and to keep us safe, they need to have modern weapons to deter our enemies. That's what the nuclear deterrent is. It's a deterrent.
Yeah, but do you increase the number of warheads? I mean, having them is one thing, but you're proposing increasing them.
Well, yes, because we're increasing the cap on the ultimate number, because defence changes over time as well, and it may be that we need more than we needed before to be sure that it can still act as a deterrent. So I think that's the reason behind that. But I think overall, to have, first of all, defence forces that can act as a deterrent for what we now know our adversaries are planning, but to put that in the context of a new global British approach, where you'll see that there's more emphasis now on the Pacific region, on other parts of the world, and to make sure that our foreign policy and our defence policy are aligned in that respect, will mean that we do spend the money more effectively. And indeed, as you say, we are spending more money. The idea that this is anything to do with cuts is
from
a
low bar.
NATO commitments.
Yes, but I think there'll be many on the defence side who say, well, that's after years of cutting defence budgets, so it is coming from a low bar in their view.
Can I say something else?
Alistair, yes.
I was just going to make the point. I think that clip that you played from Boris Johnson was at the manifesto launch.
It was.
And I think that's the other thing, is that the Tory manifesto seems to have no significance whatsoever. You had the overseas aid commitment that has just been sort of thrown over, and it looks like that's that. And now you've got this. And, and fair enough, Anita, you can say that Boris Johnson doesn't play games the whole time. But I really think Damien talked about us being in a sort of bad place. I think we're in a very bad place when the governing party actually doesn't seem to give much of a damn whether it breaks manifesto promises or not, and nobody seems that bothered about that.
Right. Well, Anita, is it worth the paper it was written on?
Well, I think think the purpose of a manifesto is to say what you want to do given the world as it is a year ago, or a year and a half ago now. But the reality is there's lots of things, quite dramatic things the government hasn't done because they weren't in the manifesto, because, for instance, COVID wasn't a huge issue. And there'll be some differences to how...
Sure.
What was
Pardon?
that?
I say we'll be hearing a lot of that as they break promise after promise after promise. I think that's going to become a very, very convenient excuse for them.
Anita?
But I mean, you know, I have to say, this is the party of, you know, strong defences, and they're cutting the army by this scale. And I was talking to somebody who's pretty senior in the military recently, who was saying that, you know, they'd be very worried about fighting any. Somebody mentioned the Falklands earlier, but they were going through the sorts of conflicts where we really, I think, are going to struggle. And I don't think this should be treated lightly at all.
All right, we're going to move on because we're going to talk about the Labour Party, and we're going to talk about Keir Starmer because we're heading towards a year of Keir Starmer's leadership running the party. He's been inundated with advice. We have Ian Watson here, political correspondent, who's spoken to a number of politicians on and off the record. Ian, I'm just going to show everybody this BBC News, your story. Peter Mandelson, architect of New Labour, one of them, urges Starmer to begin Labour policy review. What's he talking about?
That's right, Jo. Obviously, Peter Mandelson has been an advisor over a long number of years, but more recently has been talking to some of Keir Starmer's team. And he's suggesting two things. Firstly, he believes that Keir Starmer still has, as he puts it, the 2019 manifesto from the Corbyn era around his neck, a very voluminous document. And he can't immediately adopt a whole range of new policies this far from a general election. So his solution is for Keir Starmer to offer up a policy review that puts everything in that 2019 manifesto under question. And this is a similar tactic to Neil Kinnock, in fact, many years ago when Peter Mandelson was none other than his Director of Communications. He had a policy review. It lasted for 2 years, but it allowed the party to move away from left-wing commitments such as unilateral nuclear disarmament to something he would see as more mainstream, and change the party's prospectus for the forthcoming the forthcoming general election. Interestingly, behind the scenes, Keir Starmer's supporters also beginning a hold on the party machine, the National Executive Committee, very crucial. And one of the newly elected members of that, Luke Akehurst, who is in the self-styled moderate group, Labour First, but he says that Keir Starmer should move further away from Keir Starmer's own pledges during the leadership campaign. These 10 pledges, including a widespread commitment to nationalisation. He said now they have to focus in the future and stop tickling the chin of Labour Party activists. But if he does that, then he's also likely to perhaps increase this breach with the left, which has been going on really since the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, if not before. And Laura Smith, who lost her seat as a Labour MP at the last election, she's now involved in a project talking to Labour activists around the country. And she said that A, they're demoralised already, but B, it wasn't the policies which lost the election, it was Brexit. And if he moves away from that, he'll be also moving away from his own grassroots.
Right. Now, much of that, of course, was everybody you'd spoken to on the record. What about off the record?
Off the record, I suppose, is slightly more interesting, actually, in some ways.
It usually is, isn't it?
Which is why I'm on here talking about it, and they're not, Joe. But I was talking to people who'd supported Keir Starmer during the leadership election, and these basically fall into two groups.
Yes.
Those who are on the left of the party, but basically wanted Corbyn with competence. They were very keen on the pledges that Keir Starmer made during the leadership campaign, and they're now, naturally enough, finding that they're somewhat disappointed, somewhat disconcerted about the way he's actually been running things, and they're unclear about where he's going to take the party in the future. They're saying, fine to develop new policies, but don't move away from these pledges that you made on nationalisation and so on. Otherwise, there will be that breach. But there are others who are still supportive of him, but are frankly just disappointed. They are concerned that emerging from the pandemic, which he himself admits has protected him from day-to-day politics, that he isn't necessarily thinking big enough to try and capture the public's imagination. If you remember that speech ahead of the budget, the fork in the road speech, where he was setting out a different path from the government, it culminated in one policy, which was a national recovery bond. And they're saying, look, you might not need to have loads of policies at the moment. You need to have exciting policies that resonate with people and they're memorable, not a whole range of small-scale initiatives.
Ian, thank you very much. Nadia, you were elected on that 2019 manifesto. Do you agree with Peter Mandelson that that should be reviewed in its entirety?
I think Lord Mandelson is right in that we need to be talking more about policy, but I think he's wrong in saying that we need to scrap the 2019 manifesto. That manifesto contained very popular policies that would have created fundamental change to the lives of millions of people. when we're looking at the crises that we face, whether it's the coronavirus pandemic, the climate crisis, the rise of the far right, increasing inequality and poverty, these things can only be solved by bold, ambitious solutions, not by tinkering around the edges. And I think that what the pandemic has shown us is that we need that irreversible shift in wealth and power from the super rich who are profiting from this pandemic to the people who are getting us through it, people like my former colleagues as care workers, people like cleaners, nurses, etc. I think Keir is right in his analysis that we really need a post-war settlement and a post-war scale of investment in our recovery after the coronavirus pandemic. I think that we do need to be bolder. So for me, that looks like in 1945, we created the NHS, we created the welfare state.
Yes.
What we need now is to be creating a national care service, a proper Green New Deal that brings jobs to every part of our country.
All right.
And Tories' Green New Deal just does not match that.
Alistair, do you agree with Peter Mandelson or Nadia? Peter Mandelson for wholesale reform or review of that manifesto?
Well, I think that Keir's come in. He's had a pretty tough year for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that the pandemic has been dominant. I do think that both on Brexit and on COVID, he slightly disabled himself by being, I understand the reasons on COVID why he felt he had to be pretty much supportive of the government. But I think on Brexit, he's allowed himself, in a sense, to be parked because he ended up backing the deal. But I think it's, I think we spend too much time in modern politics focusing on what's gone before. Keir's got to set out a bold vision of the future. And I think rather than think about what we did in 1997, what we did in 1994, what Neil Kinnock did, I think you've got to look at the way the world's changed. It's changed massively.
Yes.
And I think if you go across all of the generations, it's about, I think sometimes people on the front bench of the Labour Party think that policy means they have to be announcing new policies the whole time. Policy is about how you generate the debates that then lead to the changes in the policy that you want to bring in when you get to an election. And I feel at the moment there's not enough of that going on, that sort of policy, detailed work, argument, if you like, about the state of the world and the kind of ideas we need.
Right. I mean, you've got the latest instalment of your diary is looking at the period of Labour in opposition between 2010 and 2015 when Ed Miliband was leader. Yeah. I mean, do you draw any parallels between those Miliband years of opposition and Keir Starmer now?
I do, actually, on both sides. I thought, well, it's one of the interesting things about going back over your diaries is you do see sort of patterns emerging. And I do think that, Tony Blair went, Gordon Brown came in, Ed came in, and Ed wanted to signal, quite a big change. And that's fair enough. I understand that, although the book is littered with me arguing with Ed about the need to defend our record, not because of an argument about the past, but an argument about the future. And then, of course, Jeremy Corbyn came in, and there's an even bigger shift. And I think that what you saw was the Labour Party, I think, sort of continue to behave as almost like we were still the government, when in fact we were in opposition. And the government was then sort of setting out change. Cameron was doing what he did and trying to get rid of the Lib Dems from around his ankles, which he eventually did at the end of this volume when he got power. And I think that the Labour Party, sometimes we talk about learning lessons of the past. I mean, I just think it's really important that the Labour Party understand, if you look at the last 11 elections, it goes lost, 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 Blair, 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 lost, 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 lost.
Right.
Now, that means you've got to have a pretty fundamental rethink. I'm sorry, Nadia, you can't just say, let's go and fight the battle we fought at the last election, because you lost it.
Right. Well, Nadia, what's your response to that? And also, because you're the baby of the House, the term we used for the youngest elected MP in 2019, you were a teenager when Ed Miliband was leader. What was your view of the Labour Party then?
I was 13 when the coalition government was elected, so
gosh,
I don't have huge memories of what's contained in the 8th volume of Alistair's diaries, but I did watch series 4 of the thing. I'm not saying that we should fight the battles of the last election. The last election was an election fought on Brexit, which I think was one that would always have been very difficult for the Labour Party. But it was also, it should have been an election about the climate crisis, about increasing inequality, and that has only got worse in the last year. So I'm saying that the solutions to that are bold and are ambitious. And in fact, Keir's 10 pledges that he made during the leadership election were very good. So I think it's about expanding on those and developing them.
All right, well, we'll come to the 10 pledges in a moment. I just want to pick up with Anita on this idea of the 2019 election being about Brexit. Well, whichever way you look at it, it was about Brexit to a large extent. I mean, that's also gone to a large extent. So all the focus will be on Boris Johnson's commitment to the newly won seats, formerly of the Red Wall. Without Brexit, winning seats like Hartlepool will be really hard, won't it, for the Tories?
Well, I think Hartlepool's a challenge in any case, because ultimately 2019, if you want to argue it was about Brexit, still didn't give the Conservatives that seat. But I think that the Brexit question is sort of a distraction and quite a convenient narrative for Labour, because I think it's about a broader disconnect that was happening between those Red Wall seats and Labour voters. And I think if the Conservative Party can continue to capture some of those ideas that really mattered to those people and voters on the Red Wall, then actually I think we will see continued electoral success, though perhaps not in Hartlepool.
Right. There was something rather striking, Alistair, that was written about, where you revealed that Alex Salmond, former First Minister, called you to say that if Yes had won in 2014, would you like to come and work on the transition team on nation building? Now, you said no then, as we know, because of your unionist position, but that now you're not so sure. What's changed?
No, I said no because I didn't think he was going to win. Look, I think if Scotland did become independent, I would want Scotland to be a very successful country. But I don't think that's going to happen. But the point that, and actually it was at a meeting we had where he said that if he won independence, if he won the campaign for independence, he would want to build a very broad-based team to try to, devise the transition from UK to an independent Scotland. So that was it. It never came to anything for a very obvious reason.
Right, but when I said your position had changed, what I meant was your view towards being a staunch unionist and independence of Scotland. Has that changed?
Well, I have a better understanding, put it that way, of why somebody looks at what's happening across the UK. I think Brexit has acted as I think Brexit is a national catastrophe, but I think it's helped the independence cause, and I think Boris Johnson as Prime Minister does as well.
Right.
But if there was a referendum tomorrow, I suspect I would still want the UK to stay as it is.
Yeah.
But I'm much more understanding of why people feel as strongly as they do.
Well, Damien, listening to that, what does that make you think?
It makes me think that Alistair's changing his mind in the wrong way. But I mean,
But does it worry you?
Well, Alistair can sort of, choose. He's a,
Yes,
he's a
I know he can do what he likes, but I mean, what I mean,
well, no, because I think.
But is it representative of other people? I mean, changing their mind or considering?
No, I have not met anyone, certainly on my side of the political fence, who's saying that. I think it's a sign of the despair in the Labour ranks, and I think this whole discussion about policy that Peter Mandelson has set up misses the point that in opposition, it's not about individual policies, it's about values. And what the Labour Party has to do, it's not a Keir Starmer problem, it's a Labour Party problem. As long as Labour espouses values, as it clearly did in 2019, that most people, particularly all those voters in the Red Wall seats, don't espouse. Those people are patriotic. They're pro the police. They want Britain to be strong. As long as Labour doesn't have those values or would share those values, then it's not going to win elections.
Right, I think we can rightly presume that Nadia and Alistair will disagree with that, but we haven't got time, I'm afraid, to go back to you. That's all we've got time for. But thank you to all of my guests for today, and I will be back at the same time tomorrow.